today. Let me see. What I want to do before we get started is let folks know that closed captioning is available. So what you'll want to do to receive that is select the CC for closed captioning from your menu bar. We also have Spanish interpretation that's available today. So with that, what you'll do is you'll go down to the menu bar and then select Spanish or English channel. And I'm going to pause here to let Carlos, our interpreter, give that announcement.
Thanks, Nu. Buenas tardes. Para avisarles que va a haber subtítulos disponibles durante esta sesión. Por lo que tengo entendido son en inglés. Si los quieren activar, le daría clic al botón que dice CC en el menú debajo de la pantalla. Y para accesar los servicios de interpretación al español, le va a dar clic al globo que va a aparecer en unos momentos y ahí va a poder escoger el canal de español o inglés.
Great, thank you, Carlos. So go ahead and select English or Spanish. Also, I'd also encourage folks to, if you're part of the general public, we encourage you to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat this afternoon. We won't be having any formal public comment period in today's meeting. A lot of good presentations today. I would also encourage folks to introduce themselves in the chat as well, our members. By doing so, you know, I think it's really interesting. I'm based out of the Portland metro area, and I know we're across the entire state. It's supposed to get to 90 some odd degrees today. That's really hot. And so I would love to know for our partners, what is the perfect temperature for you? Okay, so go ahead, introduce yourself in the chat, and then the bit of information I want to know today is what is the perfect temperature for you? And mine is 82 degrees, preferably by a body of water, but we'll go into that another time. So again, welcome everybody. I believe that Christy is maneuvering our slide deck today. We have a pretty full agenda. We want to let you know that I'll be facilitating today. We have Christy here to also support us. Any questions around OHA? Heather's here for any technical support if you want to reach out to her in the chat. And also I want to introduce Corinna Hazard, who is one of our new OHA members. Corinna is one of our folks who will be helping provide information back to you folks post meetings and whatnot. So welcome, Corinna. Glad you're here. Ooh, somebody had 77 degrees and they live in Southern Oregon. Amy, ooh, it gets hot down there. Good luck with 77 in the valley. All right, folks. So today's meeting, we have the objectives for today's meeting. I have basically the guidance committee has put together a pretty full agenda for you folks. We really want to be hearing from and learning from our partners at the affordable housing and transportation. We'll be hearing from them. We'll also have a brief discussion on compensation for the partnership members. So Christy and I have been playing with that and thinking about perhaps presenting that towards the end, because we know that there's a lot of really good information today. So we don't want to take up too much time on compensation. So we're going to put it towards the end. And if we run out of time, with your permission, what we may do is record that and have it as a video, making that available to you folks. And then we can do some follow-up. Okay, so we're going to keep that in play as well. And then also we'll be hearing from additional colleagues from OHA and from ODE, Department of Education. So lots of great things here. Thank you, folks. I'm going to pause for a second. I also want to introduce a couple of, actually 3 new members that we have brought on board. The guidance committee is really excited to invite the following folks. We have Lily Tobita and Ben Mendrin. Ben is joining Christy at the Portland State Office building today. So Ben, thank you for the wave. And then Casey Martinez is also joining us. So we have these three fine folks bringing in some more perspective for the partnership, and we'll get to know them in the weeks and months to come. So welcome to you folks. A really quick reminder as we go through Zoom meetings and being with one another. In the last few months, we've just really focused in on fine-tuning our group agreements. Again, I'm not going to go through all of it, it's right here, but a couple important pieces to remember is the piece to share the space in 2 hours. It gets to be challenging at times, but I know that this group is really interested in hearing from one another. So really practicing the piece of step up and step back. So if you're a verbal processor, really giving yourself a chance to kind of step back so somebody else can step forward. If you're one of those folks who are internal processors, we do encourage you to kind of process out loud with us. And so we encourage you to do that. So again, thinking about the different communication styles and really thinking of our intent and our impact with the things that we say to one another. So thank you for taking a brief look at that again. So without further ado, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christy. And we want to welcome our presenters today, and if they're ready. We have Natasha Detweiler and Mitchell Hanush. And please correct me if I mispronounce your name. I want to say it properly. And those folks are from Oregon Housing and Community Services. Christy, did you want to give a little more formal introduction to our friends who are presenting today?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
So we invited our colleagues, Natasha and Mitchell and Kaz and Robin, to share just a little bit of what is happening around the state as it relates to the strategy that you prioritized, increasing affordable housing that is co-located with active transportation options. So there's a lot to say, and we gave them the impossible task of trying to whittle the most important and relevant pieces to your conversation down into 20 minutes, that we could really have some good time for our conversation and discussion after they share a little bit of their work with you. And with that, I think Natasha and Mitchell are going to go first, and I'm wondering if you all want to pull up your slides, or do you want me to drive?
I think it's fine if you want to drive.
Okay.
That's okay.
Great.
I'll
right.
just, it'll probably be obvious, but I will let you know when we need to switch. So thank you all for having us here today. My name is Natasha Detweiler Davey, she, her pronouns, and I'm the current interim director of the Affordable Rental Housing Division at OHCS. And with me here, maybe Mitch, I'll just have you introduce yourself now.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Mitch Hanush. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst for Affordable Rental Housing Division at Oregon Housing Community Services. Nice to meet everyone.
Great. So thank you for having us here today. And we can maybe just go to the next slide, Christy. So I'm just going to kick us off, and then I'll hand it over to Mitch to walk us through some additional details. And so I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about what OHCS is, again, Oregon Housing and Community Services. And I think the name largely speaks for itself. There's housing and there's community services. We are here from our Affordable Rental Housing Division, which is responsible for funding the development of affordable housing across the state, as well as ensuring that there's ongoing compliance and asset, that the properties that we fund through community partners remain viable concerns, are able to continue to be operated and serve Oregonians. We also at OHCS have a homeownership division, which is specifically dedicated to, they're starting now to fund the development of affordable homeownership units, but they also have affordable mortgage program for for those that have lower incomes, with the Oregon Bond residential loan program, and some efforts around funding, foreclosure avoidance efforts. And then we have our other programmatic division is housing stabilization, or what we would call community services. So funding services to address homelessness, to the energy assistance and weatherization efforts. So kind of broadly, we kind of approach a spectrum of needs for Oregonians. And on the affordable rental housing side, we are, again, specifically really directed around funding affordable housing. We are not the state's housing authority, so we don't own and operate housing, but we fund either community organizations or developers across the state to do that development themselves. We have a statewide housing plan, which a 5-year housing plan with I think 7 key priorities that we are focused around, which include addressing homelessness, expanding permanent supportive housing, so housing that is aligned with rent assistance and services to support those exiting homelessness, as well as other often more service dependent populations. We have a broad production goal for affordable rental housing to expand the supply of housing across the state. And then kind of as the foundation to all of the work that we do, really trying to work to be centered around equity and racial justice. So as we as a division look to implement some of these key policy areas, we've intersected with Housing, Health, and Climate Committee, and are focused around, have efforts that tie toward transit-oriented development in the way that we implement our other programs. And Mitch, was there anything else that you were thinking to say on that before we move forward?
No, I think that covered kind of the general overview of who we are and what we do. Yeah, I think we'll get into the details around transit-oriented development as we move through the presentation.
Excellent. Go to the next slide. And so I'll hand it to Mitch here in a second. Just as I mentioned that OHCS is not a housing authority. Communities across the state have housing authorities, but we as a state agency is the state's housing finance agency. So we are the organization, the state agency that receives federal resources for affordable housing development, resources like a low-income housing tax credit that is a financing tool that helps build housing. And really functionally, we have both state resources as well as federal resources that we layer into projects. And so I think with that, Mitch, I'll hand it off to you to talk more around how that all works.
Absolutely. Thanks, Natasha. I told Natasha she had to go first because she's our celebrity in the agency. She's the big name. I'm the grunt. So thank you. Appreciate her showing up. And I'm sure she'll stick around to answer questions at the end. So I'm going to talk through sort of generally so as Natasha mentioned, we get state and federal resources. Each of those resources comes with kind of requirements around it when it comes to kind of compliance and also how we distribute it. We have a lot of leeway with some of them on kind of the preferences and priorities that we use to award funding to projects specifically. And other ones we have a far less leeway that's kind of prescribed by the legislature or by the federal organization that's allowing us to distribute those resources. Generally, our funding is distributed through notices of funding availability that we announce several times a year. These are documents, essentially, they legalese that kind of show what our priorities are and also how you can apply for that funding, what the baseline requirements of that funding are, and then what our preferences and priorities are around that. Often for competitive resources, which the state is experiencing a housing crisis, and most of our resources are competitive and have more folks applying than we have resources to award everyone. We structure those preferences and priorities as points. So you get scored as an application based on those points, whether you're kind of meeting targets and goals that either are laid out in that program structure or in that NOFA, or potentially something that our agency independently is treating as a priority based on statewide housing plan metrics or things along those lines. So we release those. We allow people to apply for those. They apply based on specific project plans for affordable housing developments. Generally, the timeline is you get awarded after that, about 6 months from when you apply, you can see an award, and then you can begin development. Usually it's at least 1.5 years, 2 years before developments are complete and people can start leasing up a building. So it's a long timeline. I know we don't have to complain about long timelines to our friends at ODOT. Theirs are much longer than ours even, but it is a process. And it makes evaluation really tricky sometimes because we're funding things that are not being actually developed for several years, and seeing the impact of what those criteria that we put in place several years prior can create kind of a lag that, that creates challenges in that regard. So, several years ago, we released kind of one of our first really intentional NOFAs around location efficiency and access to transit options. It's been a few years of projects finalizing that kind of cycle and getting into lease up mode with these priorities that were in place when the NOFAs were released. And we're already seeing some kind of like exciting opportunities for tenants. So when projects came in, they were funded and awarded. And now those plans are coming into reality with kind of those initial project proposals that were happening. Location efficiency essentially is an attempt to score folks based on their access to different community amenities like schools or parks or general walkability. And transit is one of those criteria where it's available. We're a statewide agency, so transit looks different in every community, and we're really aware of that. And trying to allow folks to kind of tell us what efficiency looks like in their community is something we've tried to be really open to and really flexible with. Same with access to transit options. So yeah. Next slide, please. So we queued up a few examples of kind of what does this look like when a project finally gets through this process and kind of gets funded with that baseline transit-oriented development. So here's an example of kind of one of the bread and butter, so to speak, transit-oriented development projects. It's located right in downtown Portland. There's 80 units with extremely low-income households living there. It's using some of our resources from the federal government combined with several state resources as well. And the project was actually a preservation project. That means it was already affordable housing, but either the project was in need of serious rehabilitation, or its subsidy from the federal government or from Section 8 vouchers or something along those lines was due to expire, or from just general LIHTC restrictions were set to expire. And so we award them dollars to continue maintaining affordability on that project, and generally to do some rehabilitation of the units to get it back up to the high quality we expect from most of the projects that we fund. So this one in particular happened to be in a really great location downtown. It's close to several bus lines. It's really, really close to kind of the MAX lines downtown. And general walkability is just superb. It's really close to a lot of resources and services that can be provided to tenants who, as you can see, 50% of the households in this project were either seniors or had some type of disability. And so having local access to necessary services is really critical. And as we see with transit-oriented development, having the ability to not just access the resources in your community, but access resources beyond your community is really critical, especially when you're trying to think of location efficiency with an equity lens. What does service dense and resource provision mean to different communities? Oftentimes it's not just having a park next door or having services for supportive services next door. It can be access to cultural centers. It can be access to general community that you want to be around. It can be access to different food options, things along those lines that you simply can't have in every project that you fund. So transit-oriented development allows both this service dense project siting, but also access to services throughout the city that are connected through transit. So yeah, this is like kind of what we think of often when we talk about transit-oriented development, is a project like this right in downtown Portland. The next example, if you could go to the next slide, is very different from that. And we selected it because of that as an example. This is Colonia Unidad and Esperanza Court. They are in Woodburn, Oregon. So not exactly super rural, but not a major metropolitan area like Portland or even Salem. It was funded as a new construction project. There were several units on site that had to be rehabilitated. A lot of different funding sources got layered into this, including our federal low-income housing tax credit and home resources, and then the agricultural workforce housing tax credit, the AWHTC, is a state resource specifically providing tax credits to developers who are going to provide units for agricultural workers, and then our general housing account program, which are sort of grant dollars that the state gets. So this was a really complex funding stack, which often we see in rural areas when we're trying to kind of structure these projects, in these larger projects that have kind of complex amenities or communities that they're trying to serve. We often have to layer funding sources like this to make them pencil. This one has 56 units. 34 of those are set aside for agricultural workers and their families. And because of the location of this, we have two types of agricultural workforce housing that we finance. One is on-farm housing, which is typically housing directly on farm, as the name suggests, where H2A or kind of migrant seasonal workers can reside while they're actually in harvest season. Then we have also community-based or off-farm housing, which the goal is for agricultural workers who are year-round residents to be able to kind of live in community near services and amenities that their family can access and that they can access instead of living directly on farm. This is community-based housing. The idea is that it allows families to kind of be part of the community that they're living in and working in, as opposed to kind of separated and segregated into this kind of on-farm style housing. This project was really cool in that they acknowledged that was, the challenges of that model are that you still need to provide some way for farm workers to get to the job site. And so they provide a van pool for farm workers to the work sites every day, which allows for kind of that transit-oriented development in a really different way than, siting housing right next to a MAX line in downtown Portland. This is taking folks from a relatively rural area to potentially a very rural area, but doing so en masse and as a product of the housing, as a built-in kind of service provided by the housing that they're living in, which I think is pretty cool. Next slide would be great. And then kind of lastly, just to kind of give another example of sort of an in-between as we saw it. This is a really large project located out in Hillsborough. It was new construction, orchards at Arinco. It was also, as you can see, very complicated funding sources, state and federal resources. Again, the low-income housing tax credit, which, as Natasha mentioned, federal resource. It's one of our most important kind of resources that we have as a state. That's our housing finance agency arm, or classification allows us to distribute those resources. And we're able to really get a lot of our priorities addressed through that because it's really competitive. And one of those priorities is transit. So it's no surprise that a lot of these projects that have transit access are funded through that low-income housing tax credit program. The GHAP and OAHTC are both state resources. Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credit, and again, the General Housing Account Program grant funds. And then OMEP is a really unique resource that we have, which is the Oregon Multifamily Energy Program. And it provides not huge amounts of capital, but some resources for projects that are willing to meet certain energy standards for their units in their buildings, above and beyond kind of what the baseline expectations would be. And it's generally, green buildings or LEED certified buildings. This one in particular was cool because it was a passive house, which I won't pretend to be an expert on what that classification means, but I know it got a lot of attention when it was constructed because of this. It's one of the largest passive houses, I think, on the West Coast. And it, I think, generally means not a lot of external systems are required for heating and cooling and other types of kind of general HVAC systems because of the way it's structured. A lot of the temperature regulation occurs naturally, which is pretty cool. So yeah, this one is kind of a little out in the suburbs a little bit, past kind of the general downtown core, but it's still, because it's connected to transit, it still has access to all of those resources that Portland has to offer, even if it's out in Hillsborough. So it allows families that maybe can't afford rents right downtown to still access all of the things that they might want to in the downtown core pretty easily. It's right across the street from light rail that goes straight into downtown Portland. I think that's it for that. So next slide, please. Okay, so just generally some trends and barriers, just to kind of throw these out there that we've seen initially. Again, it's still pretty early days on our evaluation of how some of these criteria have worked. So this is a lot of kind of research from general studies and best practices nationally. But just to highlight kind of the balancing act is really what I'm trying to do on this slide. Workforce housing versus service-rich housing is sort of talking about, like, so that agricultural workforce housing project that we saw is wonderful in that it provides transit for folks who are agricultural workers to get to their job site. However, we also have kind of a mission to serve folks who have high service needs for supportive services. And we have other programs that offer supportive services as a component of it, like our permanent supportive housing model. And supportive services generally mean, I guess this audience probably knows what supportive services mean, but health and safety services and addiction and mental health treatment and things along those lines that often are a different population than folks who are seeking workforce housing, which tends to be a different income band and kind of different general baseline needs. Not always, but oftentimes the housing looks pretty different. So providing transit that works for both of those populations can be really tricky. And it becomes sort of, again, a balancing act of our resources broadly. To get to this next bullet, how do we layer our state priorities and the needs throughout the state, and how do we use our resources in a way that can meet the needs of workforce housing, but also the needs of that service-rich housing, and everything in between. Transit is really valuable in that it allows people access to kind of more things than one house or household can be sited near necessarily. It allows a broader array than any specific physical proximity could offer in and of itself. But a lot of times we want that kind of resource in-house or on site, and figuring out how we balance those and prioritize those is a tricky thing that we've experienced. Another balancing act that we've seen is climate and climate resilience with that transit access. Things like van pools are wonderful in that they encourage carpooling and allow less emissions from folks if they were traveling. individually, it's probably not going to accomplish as much as something like a max line, but obviously that only exists in Portland metro area. It's probably still not as good as a bus service, which again only exists generally in urban centers throughout the state. So figuring out kind of how we allow more transit options while balancing that kind of focusing still on kind of the better options for climate resilience is sort of another kind of balancing act we have. And generally we differentiate between urban and rural when we make those kind of decisions. And when we judge folks against one another, it's always splitting those two out. But even within those two categories, it can be really varied as to people's access to transit options.
Mitch, thank you so much. I'm just going to pause for a quick second. There was a really good question from Carrie, one of our members, asking about, whether you can share any projects that were non-metro centric. Do you have any of those? Absolutely.
We fund projects statewide. Apologies for the examples. I threw them from a list at the top of mind, and they were definitely Willamette Valley centered, but we have projects throughout the state. I know we funded one in Ontario last year. It's not finished yet, but it was cited, right near kind of one of the bus stations downtown, and cited transit access as kind of one of its key criteria. We fund projects on the coast, in every part of the state. We've funded individual projects, and I could share a link at some point to. We have a map of all the projects that we funded throughout the state.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I apologize. Do you prefer questions at the end or intermixed? We can facilitate that too.
Whatever's easier. This is my last slide, I think, anyways. So.
Okay, I'll let you go on your last slide, and I think we're all getting ready to gear up with our questions.
No, it's great. I love it.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
So I'll hurry through. The last ones are just sort of, again, the balancing act. Land costs tend to be a really tricky thing for most projects getting funded in those transit-rich areas. It's really hard to secure land directly next to a major transit center because that land tends to be more expensive than an affordable housing developer can afford necessarily, or at least more competitive for that land. We've seen some success with securing land at planned transit centers. So before the transit center is actually built, building into that agreement that they hold land for affordable housing. That's been a kind of successful tactic, but is something that needs to be negotiated far in advance. And then you need to basically find a developer after the fact to come in and actually build the development, create the plans, and figure all that out on a really tight timeline. It's a tricky kind of proposal. So figuring out kind of how to secure land is definitely a challenge that we see a lot. Transit options in non-metro Oregon, as I mentioned, we do see some creative opportunities like the workforce housing in Woodburn. We really need more resources, I think, though, to support rural innovation. And I know our partners at ODOT have some clever carry-ons to this in their presentation going next, but supporting rural innovation around transit. What does transit look like in communities that don't have bus service or don't have light rail service, and how do we support those types of projects in the same way that we're kind of supporting light rail or bus access, and what do we do around that? Similarly, system development charges. These are generally charges that the city provides new construction projects to enhance their infrastructure funding. There are a lot of areas throughout the state that are at capacity for infrastructure, especially in rural Oregon. And these system development charges are a necessity for these cities to be able to actually build housing in certain parts of the city that we would want to, because they're currently at that infrastructure capacity and need to enhance it or expand it beyond where it's at already. That provides a lot of cost to the project or the jurisdiction or both, and figuring out how we can kind of balance those infrastructure needs with the need for housing in these areas is another balancing act as well. I think that's all I've got.
Great, thank Thank you so much. Before we move on to our folks from ODOT, there's about 3 questions that are here. And then I see Princess, you have your hand up. Go ahead. Why don't you go first?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the presentation. I was part of the webinar, I think it was end of May or first week of June that you guys facilitated. And I've taken that back to our housing task force and community housing planning groups here in Klamath, because in their presentation, I saw that you guys had like 362 projects, but none in Klamath. As close as Lake County had one. And the conversation is about constituting a PSH team that would then be potentially in a place to obtain the grants. And one of the questions that I heard back was, how long would it take from the planning to be eligible to participate in the cohort, more or less, when is the next cohort? And from that point, when might we anticipate funding, and what are the chances of a cohort obtaining funding support? I guess the question is really to gauge the probability of success in this effort we're trying to get into.
Absolutely. Great question, Princess. I think it's so our permanent supportive housing program, as Princess mentioned, we have we call it the PSH Institute, and generally you apply to be part of this cohort that goes through this institute, and it's a kind of rigorous, rapid technical assistance and training provision for projects to combine a development team with property managers and service providers, and use those can connect those 3 and take them through technical assistance and training together so that they know kind of how to develop, operate, and provide services for the high needs population that lives in permanent supportive housing. So we've been offering it generally once a year as a PSH Institute cohort. I know we've had some challenges with the pandemic, kind of operating as normal of a schedule as we'd like. As a result of that, we've kind of opened up the NOFA for PSH to projects or to development teams that have been through cohorts in the past, so that they have some level of training and technical assistance from the Institute, but have not necessarily bought this specific project through Institute. So if there was a team in Klamath that had, 3 years ago gone through the Institute for a project and received that training, technical assistance, and now they had a new PSH project that they were looking to fund, they would be eligible now. Whereas previously we had wanted all projects to go through that training, technical assistance. We still provide priority for projects that were able to bring their project through that whole cohort. And I think, and Natasha can correct me if I'm wrong, I think 100% or close to it of projects that have gone through the Institute have been funded either that year or the next year. We want all of those projects to succeed. We know they have the training, technical assistance that we want, and we've worked with them really closely to fix any holes or kind of plug any gaps that in funding that they might have. So we really want to see them succeed, and it gives you a really high chance of success long-term by going through that intentional training, technical assistance. So, and we have, pretty consistent state resources for permanent supportive housing. So we're really proud of the fact that we've been able to finance most, if not all, of those projects that have gone through the PSH Institute.
Great, thanks, Mitch.
I wasn't clear on some things. So you're saying that going through the Institute is no longer a prerequisite to getting the funding. And the other thing you're saying is those who go through have a high chance. But what about the selection into that cohort? When is the next date for the cohort?
It's a good question. I know we just wrapped up our previous one, so it's probably going to be at least another 6 months before that opens up again.
No, I don't. Let's find the information for you so we can provide the information. I think part of what happened this last time. We had this very awkward timing of our institute where it was starting at the end of a year, going through holidays and winter and right into an active competition. So we are realigning that so that it should start earlier. And I think that it has depended year to year how competitive the selection is for the cohort. I think I think it's for a program that's really centered on technical assistance and training. I think it's well worth it to go through the institute process. And as soon as we can poke a couple folks, I'll get the timing for the institutes, and we can post it in the chat here. But that basically, so as you go through your institute, if you start with like an idea of the project, and like we have some land, we want to build this project. And it really helps you participate with your developer, your service provider, and your property management group so that you are all learning how to work together as a collaborative team to own and operate permanent supportive housing. You're then eligible for funding, not only the building, like build the building, but we also have, the state has put resources toward the actual rent assistance and services, supportive services funding to really meet the need for permanent supportive housing. So I think it's a fantastic effort. I think so. You go through a 5 to 6 month training institute. Shortly after, you would have your NOFA competition, and then so then it's probably another, depending on your speed, if it's something that everybody is like, we're dropping everything, we're prioritizing, you go relatively quickly, but that probably is still a couple years before I think our first cohort we have, which we're on our third, we have a few projects in place from our first cohort, which was actually 2020. We ended it in March 2020, the end of the first institute. So it's taken a year and a half to 2 years following completing that training to get the projects actually built and operational, which is exciting to see now. But I'll put in the chat
Natasha.
The right contact info.
Great, thank you. I know that we still have more on this topic and we want to hear from our colleagues from the Department of Transportation. Would folks be okay, for those of you who put your questions in the chat? We will collect those questions and then follow up with Natasha and Mitch and their team to get you those answers. I just don't want to, the question and answer period is always so great with this team. And so I just want to make sure we hear from our Department of Transportation folks. So let's go ahead and do that for now. And I apologize that we didn't get more time for some Q&A. Thank you, Mitch and Natasha, for that piece. Let's go ahead and transition and hear from our folks from ODOT. Welcome to Kazim and to Robin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kaz. I'm the Strategic Planning and Communications Manager with the Public Transportation Division at ODOT, and my pronouns are he and him. My colleague Robin and I are going to be talking about a couple of programs that ODOT has coming up. Both of them are a result of the federal infrastructure investment, which you may have heard about over the last sort of 6 or 7 months or so. Effectively, Oregon received $1.2 billion in funding, of which about $400 million was flexible funding for the state to do with as it wanted to. And the two programs are a result of that flexible funding. So I'm going to talk briefly about the newly created Innovative Mobility Program, which is 10 million in federal funds and 10 million in state funds. And then Robin is going to talk about the Great Streets Program, which is 50 million in federal funds. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So the problem that the Innovative Mobility Program was created to solve is one that was referenced in the previous presentations that you saw, which is to say the ability to move people in things other than single occupancy vehicles, cars and trucks, and the relationship of that to affordability, to equity, to accessibility. We already have a program which does some of this, the Transportation Options Program, but the Innovative Mobility Program builds on this. It was a result of community feedback we received through the engagement process on the federal infrastructure investment. And the Oregon Transportation Commission, which is ODOT's governing body, set up this new program with the aim of providing grants to community-based organizations and local agencies to help underserved groups. So anyone from people of color, people who are experiencing low incomes, people who are living with disabilities and seniors, and many other groups to find it easier to walk, roll, and share rides and take transit. We have twin goals, which is first of all the equity goal, and then also the sustainability goal. We want to make sure that all of our projects are as climate friendly as possible. And the Commission also directed us to do something that we've never been asked to do before, which is to ensure that we're not just serving populations who are made up of historically excluded groups, but we're also partnering in service delivery with groups from those communities. So what that means is we are looking for partners, and that's part of our ask here today. Would you be interested in assisting us with service delivery in this program? Do you know anyone, any other organizations that might be? So if you can just move on to the next slide, please. Give you an overview of the program. It's a 3-year program, 10 million federal funding, 10 million in state funding. And we're looking at having half of that be a competitive discretionary grant program and half of that be contracted services. So in terms of what we're actually going to look at delivering, urban and rural subsidized van pools are pretty high up our list. So the idea there is we would perhaps partner with a community organization, for example, that works with farm workers. We would assist them in setting up a van pool service, and then we'd be able to help subsidize that for them, which means that farm workers going to and from the fields would have access to a safe, affordable form of transportation. But transportation options also covers a much wider array of services. Some of the other things we're looking at are pedal bike and e-bike lending libraries, including ones that could be set up in affordable housing developments. And that's something that closes one of the biggest gaps we have in public transportation in Oregon, which is the first and the last mile. So often the reason that people don't use public transit or find it incredibly difficult to use is, it'll get them from point A to point B, but then at both ends, they may have a couple of miles, 2 or 3 miles to walk. So if we're able to lessen those journeys, then we increase the attractiveness of public transportation, public transit. We also have micro grants. These are for things like bike safety helmets and classes to encourage people who haven't really used public transportation or haven't felt comfortable using a bike to learn how to move around in ways that may be new to them. So this is a very short overview of the program, and I'm conscious that my colleague Robin also has quite a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to drop my email into the chat, and I'm very keen to hear from anybody who either has anything they'd like to add in terms of the sorts of services that we should look at, whether they might be interested in partnerships, whether there's a specific problem that they've identified. We have this facility here, but nobody can get to it because there isn't a micro transit option. Those are the sorts of things we're looking to hear about. And as I said at the top of this presentation, a lot of what we're looking at is related to what the colleagues from housing talked about, and it's all about creating whole systems, creating systems that meet the needs of people from the affordability point of view in terms of housing, in terms of being able to get to and from work, in terms of being able to access groceries. And another big part of what we really want to do is to reach out into rural communities because whilst there is strong need for improved transit in urban communities, there is at least something. Whereas in rural communities, if you don't have access to a car or access to somebody who has access to a car, you are very much shut out of being able to fully participate in society. In terms of timing, we're going to be engaging over the next 3 months, hopefully presenting the results of that engagement to the Oregon Transportation Commission in September or October. And we're taking a blank slate approach. So everything that we hear over the course of this period will shape the program. It will shape who gets grants, what kind of partnerships we build, what sort of services we focus on, and what kind of geographical areas we end up delivering those services in. I'll drop my email into the chat there, and I'm very, very happy to meet people in groups or one-to-one for a more in-depth conversation, because I've really just been able to give the edited highlights here today. So that's it from me, and I'll hand over to, well, there may be some questions. If there's any quick ones, I think I can take them now, and then I'll hand over to Robin for the rest of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Kaz. Any quick questions bubbling up for folks? And as they bubble up, we can go ahead. I've asked Corinna to go ahead and capture our questions. So folks, just go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll make sure we capture it, get back to Kaz and the rest of the team presenters today. So let's go ahead and move on with Robin. Thank you, Robin.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kaz. Again, I work with Kaz. My name is Robin Wilcox. I'm working in the Public Transportation Division here at ODOT, and I'm going to talk today about another new program for ODOT. That's the Great Streets program. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide? This program really comes from a few different problems that we're trying to solve. So the first one is that the roads in our state that are both highways and also main streets through communities are some of the most challenging roads to fund and to do new projects on and improvements. At ODOT, so we do statewide transportation. We've been very good at focusing primarily on keeping vehicles moving. So avoiding congestion and delay, all the things that we all think about when we hear people complaining about being stuck in traffic. But these highways have really created barriers for local communities. So next slide, please. The purpose of the Great Streets program, Kaz already talked a little bit about the source of funding, but this is really a proof of concept program. We're looking for a program that makes improvements at a corridor scale. So again, main streets through downtowns and through communities all across the state, not just in urban areas, are candidates for the program. This focuses on things both within and along the road that really help people that are walking or rolling and biking, or places where people are waiting for transit to feel, ways for them to feel more comfortable and to be more safe. And I'll go through a list of some of the program elements in a second. Most of the projects will be about $2 million or more in size. So we're not talking about a lot of projects right from the beginning. We will have a couple of planning type projects, some that are focused on design and will be constructed in the future, but we also want to have a few projects that are constructed so that people in communities start to see the outcomes from this program as quickly as possible. So I'm managing the statewide portion of the program, but ODOT has divided the state into 5 regions, and we've got staff across each of the regions, and it'll be the regional ODOT staff that's really responsible for prioritizing the projects in their regions and proposing those to a statewide team that will select the highest projects across the state. And we are looking for members of the public to be part of that selection process as well. You can go to the next slide. To meet the basic requirements for the program, the focus is really around working with communities to highlight projects that improve safety. So when we say, what risk factors, that's just engineering speak for things that often lead to crashes. When we say things that are going to be mitigated, we're talking about the design changes that have been shown to improve those things that lead to crashes. And the project proposals need to really demonstrate how they're going to do both of those things. And then also improving multimodal access. So Kaz mentioned first mile, last mile improvements. That's really the focus, a big focus of this program as well. So crossings, ways to connect people to their local network of sidewalks or bike lanes or low traffic streets, connections to local paths for people that are walking and biking, bus stop upgrades. So both from a comfort perspective, so they can be more comfortable while they're waiting for the bus, but also to create a sense of clarity. In some communities, it's really hard to even know where you go to get on the bus. And then creating better connections to houses, housing, shops, businesses, and services that are all located along these streets. Next slide. Right now, we're finalizing the project selection process. So this will be how we decide which projects are the most important projects across the state. Similar to IMP program that Kaz was talking about, our focus here again is on equity and climate primarily, and a few other criteria. We really recognize that a lot of community members have historically not been included in transportation decision-making process. So an expectation for these projects that are being proposed here is that they really need to demonstrate that there's been a specific outreach and engagement with those communities, an understanding of how any changes to the road as a part of this project will reduce barriers for folks who need assistance in getting around, or people who don't have a car or have to share a car with people they live with, or people who don't see or hear very well, folks who don't speak English or for whom English is not their first language, and then also kids and youth. An understanding of how this project will help encourage people to walk, bike, and roll and take the bus for trips that they may currently be driving to. And then an understanding of what kind of local supports there is for the project, as well as how they're going to continue and how people in the community will continue to be engaged and included through the process all the way through construction and even after construction. And then the last three are leveraging opportunities. This is just where there are other projects that are happening on the corridor, identifying ways to minimize construction impacts or save money. Project readiness is just an understanding of what level of design or potential funding might already be set aside for projects. And then good repair is a jargon term that just talks about like, how smooth is the pavement? How old are the traffic lights or street lights? Whether or not there are curb ramps, or do the curb ramps meet the current legal requirements, or you know, when you think about the crosswalk kind of beacon and indicators, do they also make a sound when the signal comes on? Just stuff like that. Next slide. So for the eligible activities or things that we expect to see through this program, the photo on the right highlights several good examples. So you can see there's kind of clear crosswalk locations on both the side street and on the main street. This is Highway 101 through Yachats, if anyone's familiar with this. Bike lanes are, you know, you can clearly see those in this image. The streetlights and banners on the right really have kind of more of a main street kind of feel to them, as opposed to a highway kind of streetlight. And then the sidewalks there, you can see it's nice, new, smooth sidewalk surface. So it's very friendly for folks that might be rolling or using other assistance to getting around. Next slide. And then I'm not expecting folks to necessarily be able to answer some of these questions today, but these are the kinds of questions that I'm seeking input or feedback for. So first of all, trying to understand, you know, does your organization, or do you work with other organizations that regularly help folks with transportation or making decisions around how they get around? And what are those organizations in your area? If you can help connect me with those people. What makes people feel unsafe, or what makes you feel unsafe when you're walking, biking, or taking the bus or transit? And what kind of challenges do you all see as we kind of move forward with the program, and we're trying to get input from people and helping them stay involved, both in our statewide process for selecting projects, but then also once projects get going and the follow-up at the end. So our timing for the Great Streets program, we'll be doing statewide engagements over the next 2 to 3 months. Between now and September, the regions are also pulling together project ideas, so I can help people connect you with maybe your local region, or people have interest in that. And then projects will be selected in February of 2023. So like I said, we're also looking for people from partner organizations or from the community that might like to be part of that process. And that would be about an 8 to 12 hour commitment over the next a little less than a year. I'll put my email in the chat as well. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Kaz. Do folks have any questions for our two folks from ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation? We'll definitely reach out for more information and probably have you folks back again when you get to that point where you can give us more information. I know
I
this.
have a question.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead. Go ahead, Ben.
Oh yeah. So I noticed multiple times mentioning like that it's like easy, like the idea of like the projects making it easier to walk, you know, roll, access, and to make the intersection safer. Does this include safe, proper curb cuts? And if there are curb cuts in place, are those like are these projects going like to include like putting in safe and proper curb cuts? Because those are really, really important, especially for wheelchair users.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a great question. So right now, ODOT, I mean, we currently have over $100 million investment program on curb cut upgrades across the state. And I mentioned that earlier as part of the state of good repair assessment. So for the purposes of the Great Streets program, that is a key piece of this program. We're not going to invest in corridor scale improvements that would not include curb cuts that meet modern kind of legal and best practices standards. So thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, I think what we're going to do is go ahead and pause for our break. I want to thank all of our presenters, all four of you, fast and furious this afternoon. We appreciate your patience with the process. We will take, Christy, 10 minutes, or where are we at? We're behind. So we're going to go ahead and record that compensation video for you folks and send that another time. So we're cutting that out and sending that to you a later time. Do we want to start 10 minutes after? So
About 2:15.
2:15.
That work? Yeah,
that works. So 2:15. We'll resume at 2:15 and have our presentation. This particular these presentations really were brought to you by our guidance committee in light of all the things that have been happening this spring around gun violence. We really wanted to bring something forward to this particular meeting. So thank you to the guidance committee for really pushing the information forward to this group. We do want to remind folks that at the end of your partnership meeting packet, there are additional resources that we want to offer to partnership members. Lifeline, or excuse me, Lines for Life through the Oregon Behavioral Health Support Line, Lines for Life for our BIPOC crisis line, and then Responder Life, one of the consultants that works with the Oregon Health Authority. These conversations can trigger a lot of different things for our communities, and so we want to offer this for you as members of the partnership to access these resources. So with that, I want to also thank the guidance committee for their leadership in bringing these presentations forward today, this afternoon. So we have about 45 minutes. I'm going to try to have at least 10 minutes to give folks an opportunity to ask their questions. And so of both Laura Chisholm from Oregon Health Authority's Injury, Violence, and Prevention Program. She's one of the section managers. She is a section manager there. And then we have Colt Gill from Oregon Department of Ed, who's the director there. So I want to welcome these folks and give the time over to them. So Laura, I think you're up first, so welcome.
Hi, thank you. And of course, the minute you told me I was up first, my cat started yelling at the other side of the door because he feels very entitled. He actually owns our house and feels very entitled to be part of this presentation. So he may make a little
Cat, toddlers, it's all the same.
yeah, it's true, you know. And so hi everybody, my name is Laura Chisholm. I use pronouns like she and her, and for those of you who don't have a visual of me, I'm a middle-aged white woman wearing a headset. I have mostly gray hair and tortoiseshell glasses, and I'm wearing a polka dot green top that's actually kind of creating weird optical illusions. So I apologize for that, but hopefully it's interesting for all of those who do have it, have that visual. So as New mentioned, I'm the section manager of the Injury and Violence Prevention Program within the Public Health Division. And interestingly, you know, we are called Injury and Violence Prevention. We are mainly funded to do injury prevention, most of which right now is focused around overdose prevention and suicide prevention. We do recently, just much more recently, have a federal grant called FASTER that is helping us work with data related to firearm injuries, particularly from emergency room visits, and get feedback from the community around what's the best way to provide these data, and in a way that's most useful and least harmful. And least stigmatizing to the communities that are experiencing a disproportionate effect from this. So just to let you know a little bit of context. So I'll be talking a little bit about the data and also about some hopefully hopeful information related to some brand new funding we just got from this recent legislative session. So I will, and can you see my slides okay? Excellent. All right. So I'm going to unfortunately dive right in. And here is some very troubling information about firearm injury trends. The 2020 data is the most recent data that we have full access to because there's about a 1.5 year lag with our mortality data, unfortunately. But we do know, back in 2020, just under 600 people in Oregon died by firearm, and more than half of those incidents involved handguns. Obviously, those are the very worst case scenario outcomes, but there are many people who survive firearm injuries. And you can see the emergency department and hospital admissions data here. Again, just under 600 in 2019, and now up to, we're getting close to 1,000, and we think 2020 will be probably way over 1,000. So you can see, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of what we're looking at, and of course this is statewide. I'm just going to pause there for a second, let that sink in, take a deep breath. And just to let you know, I'm going to be talking about suicide and homicide. And if this feels triggering to you, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Step away from your computer for a while. I'll be talking for about 10 minutes total. So just to let you know, if you do need to go away, that's absolutely fine. I deal with this information every day, and it's still really, really hard. So, when we think about firearm injury trends, the things that we hear about most frequently in the mainstream media right now are about mass shooting events, and so we tend to think about homicide, but actually, and in some states, in some areas, homicide is a much larger issue. When you look at the overall statistics in terms of who's dying and how many people are dying. But in Oregon, we are seeing about 80%, 4 out of 5 firearm deaths are actually from suicide. So what we refer to as intentional self-injury. And at least half of those were related to firearms. So you can see the very important role that firearms play in suicide in Oregon. And I think it's information that often doesn't get shared along with the the headlines about incidents of interpersonal violence. So just as a little break, here's a picture of my 9-year-old and 12-year-old nephews taking a little spin on an electric scooter, and that is a stump that they actually have there. They're very inventive young people, and they were just taking a break from building a tree fort in the yard when this was just a couple of weeks ago. And on the right is my brother and me about 1970 in Ashland, New Hampshire. We're still good buddies. So, and the little guy on the left is my brother's son. So take a nice little deep breath. Okay, back in. Homicide, as I was mentioning, is when we look at the overall numbers of deaths, this is the number 2 cause of death. And probably not surprisingly from the last bunch of data that we were able to really dig into, this mostly happened within the context of intimate partner violence and gang violence. So historically, these mass shooting events, again, have been a pretty small proportion of, or they've resulted in a pretty small proportion of the overall deaths related to firearms. We'll be very interested to see how and if that changes over time. And I wish I could share more recent data with you, but I want to make sure that we're being accurate. So there's also information here about incidents of gun violence and with more than one death. And so, again, when we're looking at close to 600 a year, 39 incidents involve more than one person who died historically. And firearms were the mechanism of injury of the vast majority of those incidents. Okay, this is also really difficult information. I'm going to do my best to get through it. I want to say before I talk specifically, I just want to mention that one of the things that we've learned from the FASTER project that I mentioned earlier is that the context is incredibly important with this information. And so we cannot, I don't feel right about sharing this information without just mentioning what I know you all are very aware of. But, systemic racism, discrimination, oppressive social structures really, are the backdrop and the foundation for firearm violence in Oregon. And so I particularly homicide and particularly the issues that we're seeing in the urban areas right now. So I really wanted to acknowledge that. When we look at who's more likely, who has a higher risk, suicide, it's older non-Hispanic white males, and particularly in rural areas. And we know that a disproportionate number of suicides in general occur in rural areas in Oregon. And then, what we know if we've been reading the newspaper, living in Portland, young non-Hispanic African-American males are at the highest homicide rate of all. And here are some comparisons down below in terms of the general population. I realize this is a potentially really problematic way to present race and ethnicity data, so I want to just acknowledge that as well. But it's the best we have right now, and we're working to improve how we're providing this data. That Black Oregonians are at very high disproportionate risk for admission to the emergency department for a firearm injury, and also people in Oregon with American Indian, Alaska Native descent are also at very high risk. Okay, so taking another little breath. This is my dog Phoebe. She's a Swiss mountain dog. She loves snow, so I thought on a hot day like today, it might be a nice little break to take a look at her. This is her up in rhododendron, just between Christmas and New Year's this year, we did a little backpacking trip and snowshoeing trip. And there's my husband, who my dog completely adores and wants to sit. She thinks she's a lap dog, but she's a little big for that. So she does the best she can to get in his lap. So, okay. Now I'm going to share some more, hopefully hopeful information about House Bill 4045, which was passed this last spring here in Oregon. And some of you may be aware of a program called Healing Hurt People that dispatches peers to the emergency department or hospital when someone has experienced a gunshot wound, particularly related to community violence, so interpersonal violence. That program right now is just operative in Portland, but this bill is seeking to expand capacity outside the Portland area, also help to bolster the capacity, which now they're only able to serve about half the people who might be served, and also provide a more sustainable funding for this. There's also quite a bit of money that came from the legislature to help address risk and protective factors. So things that are upstream that I know you all are very aware of and interested in. So the milestones here we're going to be, this is really for OHA, primarily, we're going to be approving a training and certification program to really help to professionalize the violence prevention, the hospital-based violence prevention field, and also to seek Medicaid approval to bill Medicaid for the services that happen. And then Portland Opportunities Industrialization Center, who many of you may be aware of, POIC, is an amazing organization here in the Portland area where I live that they basically run the Healing Hurt People program. And so they've gotten funding to help expand within Multnomah County, and then also to provide grants to community organizations to address risk and protective factors. And then OHA, so my section of OHA received $1 million to give out in grants to support the expansion of Healing Hurt People outside of Multnomah County. So I realize this isn't perhaps exactly what you asked for in terms of information, but I think it's useful context for the overall conversation. And I'm going to end there. My slides contain some links for more information, and here's my program contact information. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it on over.
Great, thank you, Laura. Colt, why don't we go with you, and then we'll take some questions for both you and Laura afterwards. So welcome, okay. Colt.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Really happy to be here today. My name's Colt Gill, and I serve at the Oregon Department of Education. I'm here with my colleague, Kati Mosley, who may also pick up and weigh in on some of these topics that I'll share. We can share the slides with you after, along with a couple of handouts that you may already have in your packet. Each of those have links to further information about each of these programs. I'm going to go ahead and share screen now.
Colt, were you waiting for me to drive the slides, or?
No, I think I have it. Sorry, I just had a little computer mishap.
Okay.
I think I'm there now. So hopefully you can see the slides. Okay. So we were asked to share a little bit about the work that we're doing to provide for safety in school. And I would share this information is information that we also recently shared with the legislature in anticipation that they would help us further pay for this work and consider additional work in the future. So we know that this is not completely adequate. It is more than what some states have in place and probably less than what some other states have in place. We do believe that every student should have access to an education that makes them feel safe and be safe. but also welcomed and embraced by their peers in their community. We also believe that our families deserve to know that their children will be safe when they drop them off to school to learn. And so each of these efforts tie into that. This effort on this first slide is tied to the Oregon Task Force on School Safety, which a few agencies, Oregon Health Authority, Oregon State Police, Oregon Department of Education, and others are all party to. And in their early work, they developed the Safe Oregon tip line. And again, there will be links to these documents so you, or these websites so you can check them out. The Safe Oregon tip line allows anyone in a community to provide a tip to school and law enforcement personnel. Nearly every public school in Oregon participates in the Safe Oregon tip line, and nearly every Oregon school and school district has a link to the tip line on their front page of their website. It does work to prevent violence. It has many instances where it's been successful in preventing violence in our schools. It's free for everyone to use. Students or anyone else can access it by phone, by text, by web, by mobile app. They can be completely anonymous, and this effort is continued to be maintained by the Oregon State Police in partnership with the Oregon Task Force on School Safety. At the Department of Education, we also have an effort around statewide school safety and emergency management. We developed this work through grants with the federal government. This is allowing for comprehensive threat assessment systems that can help reduce violence in schools by identifying challenges early on and providing culturally responsive supports to individuals and groups to help head off violence before it occurs. This is all made possible through, again, a federal grant, and it's an effort that we are trying to continue into the future through applying for more federal grants, but also seeking additional funding from the Oregon legislature. The legislature also passed a bill recently, Senate Bill 554, in which lawmakers created a ban on guns in particular at the state capitol, the terminal of Portland International Airport, and a few other places, but they also allowed Oregon public school districts to create local policies to implement their own bans on weapons. So far, not every district in Oregon has implemented this policy. About 25 districts have implemented the policy. We also, through the passage of the Student Success Act in 2019, have developed a school safety and prevention system. It's a system that's designed to provide schools with a multi-tiered system of support that includes curriculum-based prevention programs and also safety-based crisis intervention programs. It's also done in partnership with the Oregon Safe Oregon tip line. It provides support for suicide prevention, behavioral safety assessments, also known as threat assessments, as well as positive school culture and climate initiatives. Around the state of Oregon, it provides for staffing regionally around the state. In Oregon, if you're not aware, there are 197 different school districts that all operate locally with their own school boards. And there are 19 education service districts that each of these school districts network into. And we have staffing at most of these 19 education service districts that help to implement these initiatives in each of the school districts in Oregon. This is tied closely to our integrated model of mental health and the work that we've done around social, emotional, and mental well-being. We created this integrated model of mental health. Again, there will be links in here that you can go to and explore it further, and we're happy to try to answer questions. This integrated mental health model was developed in partnership with the Oregon Health Authority, and also in partnership, we developed a mental health toolkit for our school districts. The mental health toolkit is in service to students and to staff members and to families. And so it provides a number of resources. There is a separate link to additional resources to help schools address mental health and provide mental health activities for school staff and for students. We also recently received another federal grant, and it's tied to another one that we have just applied for to help develop mental health and education programs. These will increase the mental health literacy for our educators in schools through digital learning programs that will be delivered to school district staff members. We also are developing and deploying credentialed behavioral health courses for educators specifically. And we've been creating what we're calling community care project infrastructure in 4 school districts in Oregon as a pilot test project. These include really mental health navigation systems for school districts so that they can support with culturally responsive, linguistically appropriate mental health supports within a geographic region. So once we have this proof of concept down, this makes us eligible for the next grant that I talked about that we're applying for, so that we can spread this framework out to more and more communities and help schools integrate their mental health work with other mental health resources in the communities. Oregon and the Department of Education have also led a number of other efforts to help ensure that our students feel safe and welcome at school. And so this slide highlights 4 of those programs. One we call the Care and Connection program. We developed this early on in the pandemic, again, with some partnership from the Oregon Health Authority to create supportive relationships among and between staff members, but also for staff members to connect more closely with students and their families and help everyone feel welcome in the school space. Oregon was also the first state in the nation to pass what we call here the Every Student Belongs Bill. This is a set of guidance and statute that helps school districts identify bias behaviors and create a bias incident response guide. It is also makes Oregon the first state in the nation that prohibits symbols of hate from being presented within school settings, whether they're online or in person. And then at the state of Oregon, through the Student Success Act again, although some of these predate that, we have developed student success advisory groups that are affinity-based to bring community together to the state of Oregon to identify strengths and needs of students and communities that are specific to a group. So we have, you can see the list here. We have the American Indian Alaska Native Student Success Advisory Group, the African American Black, the Latino, Latinx, an LGBTQ2SIA plus group, a group for emerging bilinguals. One that's just underway is the Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian, and one that we're working with the legislature on in the 23 session is a group specific to helping support refugee, migrant, and immigrant students. So that their voices are heard at the policy level and are also helping to develop local supports for students in these groups through grant making to school districts and community-based organizations. and tribes. We also have a series of toolkits to help our school districts recognize their role in supporting students who are undocumented or are DACA students. And then we have developed in partnership with the 9 sovereign nations essential understandings for our tribes and tribal students, and a single curriculum that is required in all school districts. It's the only state required curriculum in the state of Oregon, which is a tribal history, shared history curriculum to help, again, develop understanding of our 9 nations here and how we interact together. My last one here is through Addie's Act, the partnership around suicide prevention specifically. So this is in deep partnership with the Oregon Health Authority and Lines for Life, and especially Oregon Youth Line, in providing supports around suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention, and required plans that every district needs to have in place to, again, prevent, intervene, and react to suicide. So I'll stop there and first invite Kati, if there's anything that you wanted to hit on further, or anything I may have left out, to please jump in, and then we're happy to join in question and answer.
I don't have anything that you left out. I know we're going to do questions. I think overall it might be helpful if you could speak a little bit to the financial resources to districts for some of these initiatives that result in some, particularly I'm seeing questions about behavioral health supports and mental health support staff in schools.
Yeah, really good question. So there are right now, fortunately, a number of different programs that also creates some confusion over all the different ways that school districts might be able to resource mental health supports through personnel or through partnerships with other organizations that provide that service. But the 2 primary ways, and the ways that you see most school districts accessing or paying for those kinds of supports, are through the Student Success Act. So in 2019, the Oregon legislature and Governor Brown passed the Student Success Act. A piece of that is the Student Investment Account. It provides, or will ultimately provide, about $1 billion per biennium, so $500 million per year, to school districts across Oregon. It's distributed on an equity basis for them to address 2 things. So one is student mental health and well-being, and the other is overcoming academic disparities for focal group students. So a lot of school districts are using those funds to pay for enhanced mental health services. We have seen a significant increase in the number of counseling and mental health workers in schools since the passage of the Student Success Act. But the one thing that's frankly holding them back even further than the resource right now is just the workforce. So we don't have enough of these folks in Oregon for school districts to hire. These folks are in high demand in a number of sectors in the state, and especially when we try to get to culturally responsive, linguistically inclusive mental health workers in our schools, that becomes really challenging. And I should have said the second large funding effort underway right now is through federal COVID relief funds in the school system. We call those ESSER funds. Last school year, schools began to receive access to $1 billion in federal funding that they can use for COVID relief, that is inclusive of mental health services. And those funds are available to school districts to spend through September of 2024.
Great, thank you, Colt. We're going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions. And Micah, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks so much. My name is Mika.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
No worries, that's fine. Just wanted to tell everybody. So first of all, I just want to thank you all for being here. And I really wanted to say that I really appreciate the trauma-informed approach and the restorative justice-based approach you take in the Every Students Belong rule. My question is, well, I have two questions, I suppose. And the first question is about hate and bias incidents. And we know that they're on the rise in schools. And we also know that the majority of them are motivated by race. And so I'm curious if ODE is making any strides in general to increase racial literacy with our students and staff, so that not only would it act as like a preventative measure, but it would also empower and equip the educators to be able to intervene when they see things happening, as opposed to just having guidance for reacting to these events, like in the Every Students Belong rule. And then my other question is, it's a comment and a question. So we all know that the Safe Oregon tip line is a project of the Oregon State Police. And we already know that things are being underreported. And we know that a lot of students don't want to use it. And it's an unacceptable choice for communities that have been over-policed in general. And so I'm really curious as to what alternatives or technical assistance or support ODE is offering, or maybe has plans to offer to our districts that do not want to use that line at all because it's supporting the state police.
Yeah, really good questions. So I'd say on the first part of race-based violence and incidents in our schools. So I think you're correct. I think we are seeing increases. We're seeing increases inside and outside schools. So that's existing in our communities right now. I think that we have challenges in school districts in a couple of ways, both in the reporting and in responding to those kinds of incidents. School districts in Oregon, almost all the authority exists at the school level. So these 197 districts each have their own elected school board. And for nearly all events that happen outside of a few, 6 to be specific, all processes end at the school board level. So if an individual, whether they're a community member or a student or a parent, has a complaint, they go up through their system at the school level, district level, and then ultimately to the school board. There are only a few areas where that can move outside the school district to the Department of Education for an investigation and any kind of oversight. Discrimination and some racial incidents are included there. And we are one area where, or one authority that families can come to. It's a very long and arduous process. So we are working with the legislature, specifically a work group that Senator Gelser-Bluen is leading to streamline the process, to provide, again, culturally and linguistically responsive ombudspersons to help families walk through this process and to help students walk through the process, to have their needs met regarding complaints at the school district level. So that's one of the things we're doing. When you get a chance to take a look at the links that I provided and you get to the Every Student Belongs set of resources, you'll see that there are a number of resources and training tools for school staff. We also work in partnership with the Educator Advancement Council in Oregon that has been leading some work through a Racial Justice Institute, and a number of teachers around the state and other educators are participating in that effort to help develop a deeper understanding of racial justice and what that needs to look like in schools. So I think that was my attempt to get at your first question. The second question, I would say that, again, those same efforts are designed to help give students another venue to go to at the local level to get issues resolved if they don't want to use the Safe Oregon tip line. The second one is to make sure that the systems at the Department of Education are more transparent, more clear, more user-friendly to individuals who may be challenged by the local system as well. And then I think that depending on the kind of emergency at play, the partnership with Lines for Life and the Oregon Youth Line is another strong alternative when the issue is around suicide in particular. The other piece about the Safe Oregon tip line, and maybe we can try to communicate this better, but what that does is provide anonymous information to local leaders. So only in rare cases where there aren't local leaders available would the state police actually be a part of the intervention. So they pass that information to the school district and sometimes the local law enforcement, which may have its own issues, but I just wanted to name that.
Thank you, Colt. Other questions for our panelists here, for Laura, Kati, or Colt? I think there was another question regarding whether any of the, if there are funds for closed circuit video or other technologies in the building.
The funds that I named can be used for those purposes
Okay.
as well. And several districts have started doing that.
Great. Alicia, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, excuse me. I think my question regarding the closed circuit videos, I am more interested in knowing if not whether the funds can be used for that, but if OD has any plans on setting aside specific funds for closed circuit videos and other technology upgrades for schools and within school buildings. My other two questions are, one of them is, I see that there's a lot of information here in terms of racial and ethnic, belonging, and sorry, my toddler decided that she wants to jump in this conversation. And based on ethnicity, but there's very little in terms of students with disabilities. And we know that students with disabilities are also in that marginalized group. And especially students with disabilities whose behaviors are not necessarily quote unquote the norm, which will then place them in this kind of threat assessment line. Like they, if there's a specific sorry, if there are certain behaviors that come forth that are actually as a result of the disability, they will automatically get pushed into a threat assessment. And I am just wondering about what kind of protections are put in place for students with disabilities or students whose disabilities are not yet kind of recognized through an IEP or 504. But there may be knowledge already that there is a disability in play. What protections are there for students with disabilities, particularly knowing that, just because someone has a mental health issue or mental health, just because someone navigates mental health stuff, or okay, go to daddy. I'm sorry, go to dad. Sorry. Or someone who, students with developmental disabilities, for example.
Yeah.
What are the protections? And then the other one was, I guess it kind of goes in line with what Mika was already saying in terms of the lines or the tip line. I am actually more interested in whether there are plans to partner more on the local level, which I guess I'm understanding that it would be more kind of a district level thing. the individual districts partnering with sheriff's departments, police departments to regain, rebuild, and foster that community trust, so that once there is, once there are, concerns, that we will have students actually reach out to people who can then start the process of figure out where we need to go here, because mental health individuals or professionals are limited as to what they can say and what they can continue, what they can move on in terms of providing information to outside people. And that's one of my biggest concerns, is that if we limit it strictly to mental health providers as an alternative to a safe tip line, we're going to be hindered by the confidentiality that individuals within the mental health profession have to abide by. So I guess those are my 3 questions, and thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. Go ahead, Colt.
Okay, I'll try to go really quickly. I know we have a 3 o'clock end time. So on the video question, the Oregon Department of Education does not have authority either to identify specific funds within the State School Fund or Student Success Act funds to require districts to do that. That is something we could seek authority from the legislature for, or the legislature could direct school districts, but the department doesn't have that authority. Regarding students who experience disability, so a couple of spaces where I didn't point out where there are additional information for families and students. One is that within each of those affinity groups that I named, we look at intersectionality with students who experience disability. So we center on race first, and then look at that intersectionality with a variety of other identities. But disability being a part of that. And students do have, now whether every student realizes it or their family realizes that there are additional processes before they would be required to move into a threat assessment or any other kind of intervention, that, especially if it could be deemed as disciplinary in some way. And what they get is a process with their individual education plan team that is a manifestation determination. So really a process to look at, was their behavior a part of the disability that they have? And do they need to make a different kind of plan or allowances around that? So those laws and protections do exist. We need to continue to make sure that they're known to students and families, as well as to the educators. And I won't say a lot about the work on developing trust between local law enforcement and school systems and the communities that they both serve. But with Governor Brown, we have been leading an effort working with the Oregon Sheriff's Association, the Police Chiefs Association, and a few other parties to get at that over the last couple of years. Some of the relations have splintered farther and farther apart. So we're trying to figure out where to enter in each community a discussion to rebuild trust and relationship there. But I think we are a few steps away from it, honestly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Colt. Thank you, everyone. Great presentations today. I know we went just slightly over time. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. If you have further questions you want to send to Christy or myself, we can gather those, and we'll get everything in the chat, pulled together questions, and then send it back to our presenters, all of them today, and then get them back to you folks. But I do want to remind folks real quickly that we will not be meeting in August. We're taking August as a break, and then you will be getting a lot of emails from us regardless of that, though. Lots of notes and other additional committee meetings. And so welcome to all those folks who are here with us as well. Really great to be with you. And again, thank you for your time this afternoon. Any last bits, Christy?
Reminder of the supports. If need them today, or always a resource for you if you need something. So please reach out.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Stay cool out there.
Bye, everybody. We'll see you in September.
See you in September.
Bye, Connie.
Connie, I'll email you the info. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for the invite. I take you up on that. How long's the drive? 5 hours? 5 hours? Yeah. All right. I'm gonna hang up, y'all. Good to see you. Bye.